Don't tell me that the motivation for immigration crackdown is public safety when we release these violent criminals back into our communities.
I mean, think about it. What they said was no wait, no wall, no detention. Everybody came, and we shouldn't be surprised that who wouldn't want to come to the greatest country ever? But you got to do it legally. So that's our task, and I appreciate, again, the work of this committee, our staff, and our great chairman of this key subcommittee. With that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jamie Raskin of Maryland, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman began by saying the point here is to restore the rule of law. Restore the rule of law. Can you even pretend to do that if you stand by and support Donald Trump, who on day one, as the chairman of the committee just said, day one of his presidency, pardoned 1,500 insurrectionists, including hundreds of people who violently assaulted and attacked American police officers?
What's up, everybody? Major Retired Richard Ojeda here, and don't tell me the motivation for your immigration crackdown is public safety when you're releasing violent criminals back into our communities. That's how Zoe Lofgren opened the hearing, and it was a direct shot at Tom McClintock. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't dance around the issue. She went straight for the jugular, exposing the hypocrisy of McClintock and the GOP's so-called law and order stance. And let's talk about McClintock for a second. This is the same guy who ditched his burning state of California to cozy up to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. While his constituents were battling wildfires, he was busy scheming with Trump, planning how to gut protections for working people and ensure that billionaires get the proper tax cuts and screw over everybody else. And now he wants to lecture us on public safety. Yeah, give me a break. It was the perfect way to set the tone for what was to come. Republican apologists scrambling to justify Trump's decision to pardon 1,500 January 6 insurrectionists. Jamie Raskin wasn't about to let Jim Jordan or the GOP off the hook, though. He tore into them, pointing out the sheer hypocrisy of talking about the rule of law while defending a president who pardoned hundreds of people who violently attacked police officers.
How much safer are we now with these 1,500 criminals at large in Washington, D.C. and going out into the country? Are you vouching that these people are not going to be attacking any other police officers? Are you vouching that they're no longer a threat to public safety? What an outrage. What a scandal.
How much safer are we now with these criminals back on the streets, Raskin asked. Are you vouching that they're no longer a threat to public safety? It was a brutal takedown, and Jordan had no response, because there is no response. You can't talk about public safety while excusing insurrection. But if you thought the hearing was bad, did you see the CNN panel that followed? It was a class in exposing hypocrisy, and Abby Phillip was running the show.
Would always also expect to see, the hundreds of people who were convicted of the George Floyd protests of assaulting police officers to walk free, right, Scott?
Well, they were prosecuted.
How many were prosecuted ultimately?
Hundreds.
Because there were lots of people that had all their charges dropped.
I have the answer for you, and it's hundreds of them.
Yeah, I saw an analysis. I saw an analysis that summer, and most people who were charged had their charges dropped.
But what charges were they?
All kinds of charges.
If they were failure to disperse, those types of charges. The ones who were charged with violent crimes, those charges were not dismissed. They were prosecuted.
Well, they went into all kinds of diversionary programs. I'm one of the few lawyers in this country that represented people in those riots and on January 6th, one of the very few. And the way that the prosecution was handled between those two groups are starkly different.
Don't you think that there is a substantive difference between what happened on January 6th, what they were trying to do, and why the federal government has a desire and, in fact, a necessity to prevent that from ever happening again? Don't you think there's a substantive difference between those two things? One of them was trying to overturn an election.
I'll answer.
You don't think there's a difference between trying to overturn an election and violent social justice protests?
Are you kidding me? Abby Phillip wasn't letting that slide. You don't think there's a difference between trying to overturn an election and violent social justice protests? Yeah, and she's absolutely right. The George Floyd protests were a response to systemic injustice, while January 6th was an attack on democracy. Trying to equate the two isn't just wrong, it's insulting to everybody who's fought for real justice in this country.
The vast majority who people were charged with a crime, they were sheep. They followed the herd into the Capitol. Yes, there were a handful of violent people, but the vast majority of those 1,500 people were people who walked in and trespassed. And in federal court, just so you know, I've never had a trespass case in my life. Of the 1,500, it's not
way more than a handful. Okay,
I bet you it's no more than 100.
I
bet you 1,400 people are charged with federal trespass, which just doesn't happen. Ask him. It just doesn't happen.
Arthur, let's just stop with the hyperbole, okay?
It's not hyperbole. It's a fact. I'll be in federal court tomorrow. It's a fact.
You gave the impression that it's a handful of people who were charged with violent offenses.
They weren't charged with violent offenses.
That is not true.
Even if they weren't all physically attacking police officers, they were all part of a mob that created chaos and gave cover to those who were violent. And second, Aidala's argument ignores the fact that over 600 people were charged with violent crimes. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was a coordinated attack on our democracy. When Philip pushed back, Aidala got defensive, saying, "Let's stop with the exaggeration." But there was no exaggeration. The facts don't lie. The January 6 rioters were part of an organized effort to stop the certification of an election. They attacked police officers, destroyed property, and threatened to hang the vice president. Comparing that to protests against systemic racism is not just absurd, it's offensive. FAFO. If you know what that means, look it up, because it sums up the entire situation perfectly. The January 6 rioters messed around and found out. They broke the law and they were held accountable. But now Trump wants to erase all of that accountability with a blanket pardon. It's absolutely outrageous. Even the Fraternal Order of Police, a group that stood by Trump for years, couldn't stomach it. They issued a rare joint statement condemning the pardons, calling them a slap in the face to every officer who defended the Capitol that day. They said these actions diminish accountability and devalue the sacrifices made by law enforcement. This is coming from Trump's former allies, the same people who endorsed him time and time again. If they can see the betrayal, what does that tell you? And it's not just law enforcement speaking out. Republicans like Susan Collins, Tom Tillis, and even Tommy Tuberville have expressed shock and disappointment. But here's the thing. Are they really going to stand up to Trump? Or are they just going to let him continue rewriting history and emboldening the next wave of insurrectionists? Because that's what this is. A green light for more chaos, more violence, and more attacks on our democracy. Trump's pardons aren't just a betrayal of law enforcement. They're a betrayal of every single person who stood up for democracy on that day. We're only a few days into this nightmare, and Donald Trump has already shown us what the next 4 years will look like. Chaos, lies, and the erosion of democracy. If we don't hold him and his enablers accountable, it won't just be a long 4 years. It'll be the end of everything this country stands for. And that is an absolute fact. Sappers clear the way, airborne all the way.